are excited for you all to join us for this morning's coffee break. We do these short opportunities to connect over a cup of coffee or some sort of morning beverage to discuss hot topics and sustainability with different guests. And so I'm going to turn it over to Daniel, who's going to introduce our speaker this morning. Daniel's on our education committee.
Hi, I'm excited to welcome Amanda Welch, who is a research analyst at BloombergNEF, which is new energy finance, I think is, yeah, okay.
Perfect.
So Amanda is a research analyst there on the grids and utilities team. She's based out of New York, and she covers regional analysis on utility strategy in North America, along with specialties in technology trends for grid evolution, offshore transmission, utility investment. Prior to working at BloombergNEF, Amanda and I worked together at EDF Renewables in a group called PowerFlex, or part of that effort there. We had a lot of fun doing stuff not on the grid side, but on the behind the meter, on premises, on sites. And prior to that, she graduated from University of Massachusetts at Amherst. So she's, I guess, a proud Minuteman.
For sure.
Awesome. With that, I will hand it over to you, Amanda. Thank you for joining us. Really excited to have you with us.
Thank you for having me. Good morning, everyone. I guess I will jump right on into it. All right. So could I get some confirmation that that is Sharon? Amazing. All right. So I'm going to chat today about resiliency in our power grid. So this is your utility, and they deliver electricity to you. When the system works, everyone's happy. But as we all know, sometimes the system breaks, and we've all been there. Many of us have strong memories of a power outage that disrupted our daily lives. I can remember back in 2008 when an ice storm blew through New England, coating everything in its midst. We lost power for 12 days. No lights, no refrigerator, no TV. But it also made us think about our power and our power providers in a way we never did before, turning what was ignorant bliss into downright hostility. And the outages of the next generation will be even more punishing as we humans and our homes are electrified. Imagine no power to charge your electric vehicle, or no phone, no electricity to cook on your induction cooktop, and no heat for your electric heater. As our climate continues to change, there will be an increase in the frequency, severity, and intensity of storms, turning that once-in-a-lifetime ice storm into once in a decade, or perhaps even once in a year. In 2022 alone, there were 18 weather and climate disasters where overall damages reached or exceeded $1 billion. These events occurred throughout the entire year and impacted every region of the US, with the highest monthly cost topping out at $171 billion last December. And these disasters have become more frequent. Over the last 3 years, there was an average of $20 billion events per year, up from an average of 3 in the 80s and 6 in the 2000s. And power reliability has not gone unscathed. So on the surface, the data suggests the duration of power outages has been steady, around 2 hours of outages, nothing crazy. You'd seem to believe that our power network has defied all odds. However, when we factor in major events, the average power outage increases 2 to 3-fold. The latest data from 2021 shows that this trend is at an all-time high. The average duration increased 5.5 hours, all in 7.5 hours without power, which is not only a nuisance, but poses a major risk to vulnerable populations. And so what causes these events? You can point a finger many places, but typically squirrels. Surprisingly, these furry friends cause nearly 10% of all outages by chewing on wires or coming into contact with equipment. Often, equipment might overload, or a utility may experience an intentional attack like vandalism or a cyber threat. However, An increasing amount of power outages have been linked to weather. So, how do you build a resilient power system? First, let's define that word, resilience. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission defines it as the ability to withstand and reduce the magnitude and/or duration of disruptive events, which includes the capability to anticipate, absorb, adapt to, and/or rapidly recover from such an event. So what sticks out to me here is withstand. So when a storm makes landfall, can we take the punches without falling down? Reduce magnitude. Can we isolate those affected areas and limit exposure? And this is a unique one, but absorb, which I take to mean cushioning the effects on the macro system by sharing resources in times of need. There are many ways to build a resilient power system, and we're going to look at 3 approaches that we think can scale and make a real impact, beginning with an approach to withstand natural disasters called grid hardening. Hurricane Ian was a tropical cyclone that brought devastating wind and flooding damage to the Southeast in September of 2022. Ian became the 5th strongest storm ever to strike the US, and with estimates suggesting $65 billion in property and infrastructure losses, it is also one of the costliest natural disasters in US histories. Utilities can withstand the impacts of hurricane winds, which break poles and they thrash debris onto power lines, by undergrounding. And undergrounding is truly as simple as it sounds, just burying those power lines. So this completely removes the above ground elements. Following Hurricane Ian, Florida Power and Light saw that neighborhoods with underground power lines performed 5 times better than those with overhead power lines. However, whenever we talk about undergrounding, cost always comes into the conversation, and rightfully so, because it can be 5 to 15 times more expensive than just stringing wires above ground, which is usually why projects don't move forward. But the reality is that ratepayers are already paying for these billion-dollar storms one way or another, and this could minimize the total cost of future storms. And at a country level, undergrounding distribution lines has been a fad that simply hasn't gone away, remaining around 25% of total distribution spend each year since 2005, for a combined total of $92 billion from 2005 to 2020. And while it looks like nothing's really changed, if we zoom into a utility level, you do see a ramp up in spending. So this is Pacific Gas and Electric in California, who accounts for 6% of spend, going from $200 million in 2005 to nearly $500 million in 2020. And data from the last 2 years is not yet available, but it will likely show an even steeper growth. And at a country level, we see a diverse array of states adopting this practice. A darker shade denotes higher spend in 2020, such as those states on the coastlines and in the north. But for some storms, you can only reduce the magnitude of impacts by offering independence from the main utility grid during a disaster. The Camp Fire in 2018 was the deadliest and most destructive wildfire to hit California. Following this terrible event, the state mobilized and enforced more stringent wildfire mitigation practices by their utilities. In addition to undergrounding, utilities are utilizing distributed energy resources. In 2022, California accounted for 31% of all behind-the-meter resources in the US, which includes residential and commercial solar PV and energy storage. And there's no slowing down. BNEF expects this figure to grow from 17 gigawatts in 2022 to 44 gigawatts of total capacity by 2030. And when we look at the location of these assets, we start to see that they align with wildfire zones, especially along the coast and in the south of the state. However, we see in the north, where there's very high wildfire risk, there aren't as many resources. So it's important to note that distributed resources and the aggregation and islanding of these resources, known as microgrids, doesn't reduce wildfire risk. It only makes shutoffs more tolerable. So this approach makes sense in areas that are affected by public power shutoffs, but not those that are in the line of fire and will actually sustain fire damage. And so when you take these resources and you combine them with analytics, demand can be smarter, and they can respond to events such as last year's September heat wave, which literally prevented a blackout. So during this event, the grid in California was strained as it sought to keep up with a surge in air conditioning demand to beat the heat. Utilities were told to prepare for blackouts as demand set a new record at 52 gigawatts. And so for context here, hourly load in California was less than 35 gigawatts for nearly 95% of the last 3 years. And so a combination of formal demand response programs with virtual power plants and owners of behind the meter resources reduced energy demand by nearly 2 gigawatts in half an hour, showing the capacity of these resources to truly affect the grid during strain, which will only become more potent as more come online. And I think demand response shows that customers want to help the grid and they want to help one another, which leads us to our last approach, interconnectors, which refers to high voltage cables that connect the electricity grids of neighboring utilities to cope under stress, absorbing the ultimate impacts on the entire system to reduce impact. So Winter Storm Uri in Texas is a fabulous example of the power of interconnection. The storm sent temperatures plummeting, resulting in snow, ice, and blackouts from the additional household demand as people cranked up their electric heaters. This meant summer-level energy demand in midwinter. The power supply was simply not ready, and at its worst point, over 40% was forced online. And while there are many lessons learned here, the Department of Energy found that interconnection would have cushioned the damage. For each 1 gigawatt tie from Texas to the southeast, $1 billion in damages would have been avoided. And the story is the same throughout the entire country. During the same storm, if the Delta and Plains region were interconnected, they could have saved $100 million per tie. And if New England, New York, and the Mid-Atlantic were connected during the bomb cyclone of 2017, $80 million in damages could have been avoided per tie. This includes additional connections between the Mid-Atlantic itself because the east and west sides are currently disjointed. And so my last point here is that the transmission system as it stands is trying to be resilient, but we need more limbs. We can see this during Winter Storm Uri. The dark blue indicates the coldest temperatures, and as lines get redder, the capacity on those lines are being utilized. So here on December 22nd, the storm is hitting in the breadbasket, and the West is trying to support that extra energy demand. By December 23rd, the storm has moved farther east, and the system is responding throughout the country, as indicated by this patchwork of orange and red. And by Christmas Eve, the storm is settled in the east, where a lack of existing capacity is straining the system to its full extent, as seen by these maroon colors. Additional links would reduce that grid strain and limit costs to ratepayers, as this support right now is very expensive. And so here we are. You've now successfully navigated these 3 techniques to build a resilient power system. You've seen that grid hardening allows the power system to withstand the onslaught from hurricane winds. Decentralization reduces the magnitude of grid strain during extreme heat events, and interconnectors can absorb the shock of storms on the macro system by providing support. But this is really only the tip of the iceberg. While we don't know when or where the storms will hit, we do know that they will keep coming and are only going to get worse. In order to be truly resilient, our utilities, our regulators, our policymakers must start being proactive, not reactive, because an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Thank you. I'm gonna keep sharing. We can keep sharing. Let's go.
If folks have questions for Amanda, we've got time for some discussion. Thanks for the presentation.
Yeah, I'm also curious to hear, I mean, everyone here seems to be in different parts of the industry. You know, where your perspective comes from, if you see your utilities doing something, if you see changes on your grid, if you're seeing more strain, more blackouts, things like that. I am a researcher, and chatting with everyone is always something that I love to get more information. So I'm happy to take the conversation wherever.
I have a question that maybe other people know the answer to. It may be obvious to other people, but what is the behind the meter resources you talked about under the decentralization?
Yeah, sure. So behind the meter resources are just on site. So rooftop solar, energy storage that is on someone's home or at a business. And so that's usually what we classify as behind the meter resources. So those rooftop solar and energy storage.
I have a question, I guess. So I think a lot of times my brain goes to the distributed energy resources, not just because I worked in that space, but because it seems approachable. It seems like something that is knowable. I occupy various buildings and I talk to the people who manage those buildings, whether they're the building that I live in or the building that I work in. I have access to that. But I think in many cases, the grid or the interconnectors, even more so, are these sort of abstract, faraway things. And there's layers of policymakers and whatnot, but there's still, like, somebody gets a contract and builds those things. Somebody gets a contract to dig those trenches and put those wires in the ground. And I'm curious, like, what are the economic potentials around some of those construction projects? How much spend is on the table in those spaces? And maybe if you have it in each of those spaces, but I'm just curious.
Yeah, no. So you mentioned layers. And so everything about the energy sector is layers. Any solution we're trying to see in terms of just regular old reliability is we need a whole toolbox and we have to utilize, each one. And so in terms of each of these, for interconnectors, I'll start with interconnectors because that might be the easiest place to actually think about capital investment that utilities are putting forward each year. So right now in the US, there are, I'm sure you've probably read about interconnection queue backlogs and all these bottlenecks and, what have you. Truly the only way to solve these is through interconnection. It's just through building more lines, putting more wires and poles in the ground. Depending on the utility, depending on the region, it's billions of dollars a year. It's a tremendous amount of money, but the issue is that utilities can actually put things in the ground because permitting is taking a really long time, whether that be at the federal level or at the state level. There's a lot of environmental regulations. If you look at California, land is super valuable, and also environmental guidance is really stringent. So it's really hard to do anything. So there's a lot of money, I'd say, in each of these. In terms of decentralization, that's definitely more of a consumer-led program, unless the utility has some sort of, let's say, pilot for, we'll give you $5,000 and you can put this Tesla charger on your house sort of thing, which is really awesome and definitely pushes the needle on adoption rates in a lot of states. But those are usually short-lived, and so it's trying to create that momentum. So that's going on there. And then grid hardening, it depends the city and state, but in light of Maui a couple weeks ago, we're actually thinking that a lot of utilities are going to start to really ramp up grid hardening because of the liability that they now have if they start a fire or another extreme event. So. A good question. Yeah.
Just as a follow-up to the discussion of Maui, and Hannah Roth is on the call from our education committee, and she's brought this up a couple of times, that the grid went down during that situation, and so then you've got all these people without power, and we've been just talking about this idea that, like, no one's coming to save us, how do we, we want the grid to be resilient, but we also want people and buildings to be resilient. So what's the connection between those two things? Or, are you seeing anything I don't know, unique or innovative in the connection between that, between
sure.
people and buildings and the grid.
I mean, I'd definitely also be curious to throw that back on you guys as the Green Building Council and see different sustainability approaches that you guys are seeing in the field. But there's a lot of really interesting things going on, a lot of different microgrids in different communities, usually rural communities, actually. So the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law provided something like $13 billion simply for rural electric cooperatives and small and medium utilities. And so we have a lot of rural communities and remote areas that, power lines just don't make sense. The power line that gives us power always goes down. We always need to fix it. Doesn't make sense to rebuild it. Instead, let's make that community more autonomous and let's create a microgrid. And so we see that happening many more places, and utilities being more gung-ho to pursue that, because it's also a bit of a friction there, because that's almost reducing the need for a utility. If you think about it, I mean, if I'm autonomous, well, I don't need you. I can provide my own energy. I don't need the wires anymore, that sort of thing. And so there's definitely some friction that's going on in the industry right now, but because of these reliability and resiliency metrics that utilities are having to hit, there's a lot of innovation that's going on. And then, a lot of critical facilities like universities or hospitals have their own on-site gen, whether that be diesel in some cases, but hopefully moving towards the renewable side of things.
Other questions for Amanda?
I can also sing and dance. So, I mean,
I have another question. I think you kind of already touched on it when I think Daniel's question overlapped, but what, and maybe Emily's too, but what impacts like utility companies' willingness to spend more on undergrounding, or, and this may vary by state, but the Maui situation, liability is obviously becoming an incentive, but what are the other incentives out there? Or reasons that utility companies might spend more upfront? Like, how do we make that argument to?
So utilities definitely are in the game for undergrounding. Like, if I can build a line and it costs, let's say $1 million, or I could underground it for 15 million, I'm getting a return on equity of both of those projects of 15%. I'm going to want the $15 million project. So utilities are excited for this opportunity. I would say from that point of, there's capital that can come in from these huge projects. There's returns to be made there. So they're definitely looking into it and ramping up. I mean, Florida has a huge program. California has a huge program after all the wildfires. You see Illinois even has programs. A lot of downtowns throughout the entire US have programs just for beautification, actually, just because wires are a pretty gnarly sight. And so any new wire that's going to be put on the distribution grid, let's put it underground so that it's a little bit cleaner and nicer. I guess it goes back to, like, how can we ensure that regulators see what's actually needed to approve these projects? Because a utility can want to do whatever they want to do, but if it's not approved by their regulator in their state, it won't go anywhere. And so that obviously comes down to, if you're putting forth this undergrounding program that is very, very expensive, is it actually in the benefit of the ratepayer? If it is, then okay, let's pursue it. Is it actually going to provide really great benefits? Is this going to be in high risk zones? Does this make sense? Okay, let's go for it. If not, it's not going to go forward. It doesn't make sense. And so we have to make sure that those sense checks are still within our regulator space. And I know some states, there's a bit of in opaqueness over how, you know, regulators are elected and you know, some of those backings in mind. And so I think it's always making sure that what we're doing actually makes sense in terms of putting out a lot of capital up front. And then on the flip side, there's digitalization. So a lot of these processes could be done through a digital technology that is a lot cheaper. And again, when it's a lot cheaper, utilities are a little bit, you know, pushing away from it a little bit more than those large capital projects. And so we need to make sure that our regulators and our benefit cost analyses and our legislation and, you know, just the way that utilities operate, they are constantly trying to modernize, and our approvers are aware of these next gen tech that could be really cheap and do a lot. So for example, a dynamic line rating. You can put a dynamic line rating on a transmission line that is constantly congested. That will increase its power flow for a little bit, and so more energy can go on it. So that reduces the need to build another line. So things like that. That might have been a roundabout way to answer your question, but there's definitely a lot of nuances in approvals and the approaches here.
Good morning, this is Hannah. This is very, very interesting. And Emily asked my question so succinctly, I could have never done that. I do have a question about the interconnectors, and I think we've all been watching the Grain Express try to get an okay to go across the Midwest and particularly our state. I would never ask you to rate, you know, grid hardening, decentralization, interconnectors, like which is the most important, or which do we get the most benefit from? But it seems like the interconnectedness has real benefits. But do you see any way or getting around, like not in my backyard?
Yeah, and that's the Grain Belt Power Express. I actually just completed some research on some of the biggest transmission projects that are making headlines, that are going through several states, things like that. And Grain Belt has definitely hit a lot of snags. You know, rightfully so. You have a project that's hundreds, like something like 800 miles long, going through 4 different states. You're going to have a lot of those issues. And so I think inherently in any large infrastructure project, it is very hard to avoid that not in my backyard. Compensation is a great motivator for landowners, to be quite honest with you. If you're being rightfully compensated for this transmission line going through, that usually pushes projects faster, but it also is very important to make sure that the stakeholders are included in the process and they're not just getting, you know, a paycheck and shut the door sort of thing.
But Amanda, if every one of these projects takes 8 to 10 years, we're up a creek without a paddle.
I know. So the federal government has done a couple things recently. So a couple months ago, the Department of Energy and 9 other agencies signed this MOU that federal review, which usually could take 4 to 6 years for federal review of just permits, what have you. It is going to take 2 years. And the DOE is going to be at the helm, in charge of making sure that these permits go through, and then all these agencies are talking to each other. So that will reduce the time for federal review. We also have, you know, NARUC, which is the National North American Regulated Utility Commissioners. I think I got that right. They've been going through to every region for the past 1.5 years, talking to regulators, state energy departments, utilities, and saying, what do you need from us? What are the biggest barriers you see? How can we help? How can we make sure that this goes faster? What is the lessons learned? How can we, you know, push the needle a little bit more? And so there's definitely a lot of knowledge sharing. And then at the end of the day, I mean, it's a bit left field, but a federal transmission system with a more centralized approach could be a solution. It would be very effective. Nearly every other country in the world has a centralized transmission grid with, you know, one operator. Right now we have 9 different regional operators, hundreds of, utilities, so just many different players in the scene. The IRA puts a lot of money towards studies to see what does a macro grid look like? What would it mean if we could funnel power from, PJM to, so like Pennsylvania to Missouri? Like, what would that look like? What does it mean to move wind from South Dakota to the coastlines of Washington? We can't do that right now. We need it. Clearly, we need it. There's study after study. What does this look like? How do we actually do that? And so FERC, the DOE, all the national labs, many different research consortiums are trying to figure out what that looks like. And I think there'll be funding down the line to improve that, because there's discussions of a mandate for region to region connection. So right now, the regions have, let's say, something like 5% connection between each other. Don't quote me on that. That's not right. Just pull it out of the air. But FERC is now saying we need you to have, perhaps 20 to 30% of your capacity available to move between these regions, which will truly change the dynamic of how our power system moves. So there's a lot going on. That was a lot. There is a lot going on. It is definitely huge timelines, but slowly but surely things are changing.
Well, we are at our time limit here, a little bit past 10:30, but I want to thank Amanda for a great presentation. Really good information. And I will just leave us on just a tiny little hopeful note that I had learned that Ameren, our electric utility, applied for the Grid Resilience and Innovation Partnership Program, GRIP, through the DOE, that I think is part of the bipartisan infrastructure, that it came from that side of things, not the Inflation Reduction Act. So I'm told that they'll learn whether or not they receive that funding in the fall of this year, which we're very close to. So that's exciting to know that they're being proactive and looking at those federal opportunities, because a lot of Missouri is not doing that. So awesome. Well, thank you so much, Amanda. A great presentation, and thanks everybody for joining us. Have a good weekend.
Have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks, Amanda. Thanks, Emily.
Bye all. Thank you. Bye.